What do you do when uncovering your family's secrets feels like stepping into a real-life thriller? For Bella, it all started with one phone call. Story 1, The Drummer's Daughter. Bella and her boyfriend, Ryan, were driving through the quiet suburbs one evening when she blurted it out. "I think I want to find my real mom," she said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Ryan glanced over, surprised. "Your adoptive mom won't take it personally?" Bella shook her head. "I love her. But I need answers, you know? She adopted me in her 20s and she's never said much about where I came from." A week later, Bella found herself dialing the number she'd uncovered through hours of online searching. Rang. What? Twice. Then a woman answered. "Hello?" Bella's heart pounded. "Hi, my name is Bella. I think you might be my biological mother." The line went dead. Ryan, sitting beside her, watched her face crumble. "She hung up?" "She hung up," Bella whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. But the story didn't end there. The next day, Bella got a call from a man named Frank. He introduced himself as the woman's husband. His voice was blunt, almost too casual for the bombshell he was about to drop. "Look, I don't know why my wife didn't just tell you the truth. She's complicated. But yeah, she's your biological mom. She had a rough past. Married young, cheated often, didn't know who your father was. It could have been some guy named Joe, a drummer. That's all I know. She put you up for adoption when you were born?" Bella sat frozen, the words swirling in her mind. Joe the drummer? A father she might never know? She felt as though her whole identity was slipping through her fingers. Ryan helped Bella dive deeper. They scoured old records, even managed to track down one of her two biological brothers. One was long gone, killed in a freak accident at a pipe manufacturing plant. The other had vanished entirely. One night, while sifting through a box of old letters from her great-uncle, Bella stumbled on a shocker. A bundle of handwritten love letters addressed to a man. Her uncle had been secretly in love with someone at a time when being openly gay could ruin your life. "Look at these," Bella said, handing the letters to Ryan. "This whole family has been hiding secrets for generations. And the secrets didn't stop." A faded newspaper clipping fell out of one of the envelopes. It told the story of a duel on a quiet street in Iowa, over 100 years ago. The headline read, "Fake duel turns fatal as real bullets are fired." Bella recognized the name of the man who had been killed. It was one of her ancestors. Her voice trembled as she read it aloud. "They staged the duel to settle a fake feud, but someone loaded live ammo." Ryan leaned in, his brow furrowed. "And they never found out who did it?" She shook her head. "No. The whole thing just faded away." As Bella pieced together the puzzle of her ancestry, she realized her life had been shaped by secrets, lies no one wanted to face. Even her adoptive family wasn't spared. One night she confided in Ryan. "You know, my adoptive mom had her share of heartbreak too. Her brother died young in a freak accident. And you know what's crazy?" "What?" Ryan asked. "She never even got to meet her biological dad. The only thing they ever knew about him was that his name was Joe. Joe the drummer." Twist. Weeks later, Bella and Ryan decided to visit a small town where Joe might have performed decades ago. As they stepped into a dusty old music shop, Bella spotted something hanging on the wall, a black and white photo of a band. The man in the middle was holding drumsticks, his grin cocky, his hair wild. "Ryan," she whispered, pointing to the name written on the photo. It said, "Joan the Hurricane Carter." "Do you think?" Ryan started, but Bella's heart was already racing. She needed to know. Could this man, this mysterious drummer, be her father? Or was he just another loose thread in her family's tangled web of secrets? Question for you. If you were in Bella's position, would you want to track down Joe, even if it might uncover more painful secrets? Let me know in the comments. Backhand index pointing down. Story 2, The Unmarked House. Emma and her boyfriend, Jake, loved exploring old neighborhoods. It was a quirk of theirs, picking a random street, walking hand in hand, and imagining the lives of the people who once lived there. That's how they found it. The house was at the end of a street no one seemed to visit. It stood crooked as if one side had sunk into the earth. The windows were blacked out and a single wooden sign was nailed to the gate. Jake squinted. "What does that say?" Emma stepped closer. "It's in some weird language. I don't recognize it." "Latin?" Jake guessed. "Maybe." Emma tilted her head, staring at the faint words carved into the wood. But why would anyone put up a sign in a dead language? That's when they heard the faint hum. At first they thought it was the wind. But no, it was coming from inside the house. A soft, low vibration, like something big and alive was breathing behind the boarded windows. Emma grabbed Jake's arm. Let's go back. This place feels creepy, he finished. Yeah. But as they turned to leave, the hum grew louder. They froze. Is it just me, or does it sound like it's calling us back? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma felt it too. An invisible pull, something urging her to stay, to walk through the rusted gate and step inside the house. Her feet almost moved on their own. Don't, Jake said sharply, grabbing her wrist. She snapped out of it, gasping. Let's just go. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the hum. The way it seemed to get louder as they walked away. The strange, twisting letters on the sign. Finally, she got out of bed and started searching. She typed the words she remembered seeing into every translation app she could find. But nothing came up. Then at 2 a.m. her phone buzzed. It was an email from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line read, "You're looking for the unmarked house." Her heart raced as she opened it. The email had no text, just an attachment. Emma hesitated. Was it a virus? A scam? But curiosity won. She tapped on the file and a grainy black and white photo filled her screen. It was the house. Only, in the photo it looked brand new. No boarded windows. No sinking foundation. Just a bright, pristine home with a lush garden. The caption below the photo read, "Demolished, 1983. Emma stared at the screen, her pulse pounding. That's impossible, she whispered to herself. Jake stirred awake beside her. What's wrong? She showed him the photo. That's not possible, he muttered, echoing her thoughts. We saw it today. Emma nodded. But according to this, the house hasn't existed for over 40 years. The next morning they went back. The house was still there, broken, silent, and leaning. But something was different. The wooden sign was gone. Jake nudged her. Look. Emma followed his gaze to the front door. It was open. Wide open. Nope, Jake said, stepping back. Not doing this. But Emma couldn't resist. Just one look, she said, stepping through the gate. Emma? Jake hissed, but she was already inside. The air inside the house was heavy, like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. Dust coated everything and the floorboards creaked with every step. In the living room, a single photo hung on the wall. Emma walked closer, squinting at the faces in the frame. There were 4 people, a man, a woman, and 2 children. But their faces were blurred, like someone had smeared their features with paint. She reached out to touch it, and the hum returned. It was deafening now, vibrating through her chest. Emma stumbled back, clutching her ears. Emma? Jake shouted from outside. She turned to leave, but before she could move, a voice whispered in her ear. Help us? She froze. Help us, it repeated. Emma bolted. Outside, Jake grabbed her by the shoulders. What happened? There's something in there, she gasped. I heard it. Someone, or something, wants help. Jake shook his head. No. We're not doing this. Whatever's in there, we're staying away. But Emma couldn't let it go. Later that night she got another email. This time it was a single line. Come back alone. Emma stared at the screen, trembling. Could she trust her instincts? Or was the house luring her into something she couldn't escape? Question for you. If you were Emma, would you go back to the house alone, or would you leave the mystery unsolved forever? Let me know in the comments. Backhand index pointing down. Story 3, The Locked Bedroom. Lena and her boyfriend Max had just moved into their first apartment together. It was small and old, but the rent was affordable, and they loved the charm of its creaky floors and vintage fixtures. But from the moment they moved in, there was one thing that felt off. The bedroom door at the end of the hall wouldn't open. Maybe the landlord uses it for storage? Max suggested as they unpacked. Lena frowned. Then why didn't he mention it? The door was locked with a heavy brass padlock, the kind that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Scratches marred the wood around it, like someone had tried, and failed, to pry it open. That night as they lay in bed, Lena couldn't stop staring at the door. It felt wrong. Like it didn't belong in their cozy apartment. Do you hear that? She whispered. Max groaned. Hear what? Scratching, she said. It's coming from the locked room. Max sat up, rubbing his eyes. He listened for a moment, but the apartment was silent except for the hum of the fridge. I think you're just tired, he said, pulling her close. Come on, go to sleep. The next day, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that something was on the other side of that door. When Max left for work, she grabbed a flashlight and walked down the hall. She knelt by the door, pressing her ear against the cold wood. At first she heard nothing. Then, a faint shuffling sound. Lena jerked back, her heart racing. Is someone in there? She called. No response. She called the landlord, her voice trembling. "Hey, I just wanted to ask about the locked room in our apartment," she said. "What's in there?" The landlord's voice went quiet for a moment. Then, "I told you not to worry about that room." "No, you didn't," Lena insisted. "Yes, I did," he snapped. "You don't go near it. You don't touch it. That was part of the lease." Lena's stomach churned. "Why can't we go in?" The line went dead. When Max came home that evening, Lena told him what had happened. "That's ridiculous," he said. "It's our apartment. We should be able to see what's in there." He grabbed a hammer from the toolbox and marched down the hall. "Max, wait," Lena pleaded. But he didn't stop. He swung the hammer at the padlock once, twice, 3 times. It didn't budge. Then the scratching started again. Max froze, his hand hovering over the lock. "Did you hear that?" Lena nodded, her face pale. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, like something was clawing at the inside of the door. "Stop," Lena whispered. But Max was already backing away, his eyes wide. "Let's just leave it alone," he said. That night, Lena dreamed of the door. In her dream, it swung open on its own, revealing a dark, empty room. She stepped inside, her bare feet sinking into the cold, damp floor. "Lena," a voice whispered from the shadows. She turned, but no one was there. "Lena," it repeated louder this time. She woke up gasping, her heart racing. The next morning, the padlock was gone. Lena stared at the door, her hands trembling. "Max," she called. "Did you?" He joined her in the hallway, his face pale. "No. I didn't touch it." The door creaked open. Inside, the room was empty, except for a single chair in the center. A thick layer of dust covered the floor, and the air was heavy with the scent of mildew. On the chair sat a doll, its porcelain face cracked and its black eyes staring directly at the doorway. "Is this some kind of joke?" Max asked, his voice shaking. Lena didn't respond. She couldn't. The doll's head turned. They slammed the door shut and called the landlord again, but he didn't answer. That night, the scratching returned, but this time it was louder. It moved down the hall, stopping right outside their bedroom door. "Max," Lena whispered. He grabbed her hand. "We're leaving?" But as they reached for the doorknob, the lights flickered and went out. "Question for you. What do you think Lena and Max should do next? Confront whatever's in the apartment or leave everything behind and never look back? Let me know in the comments." Backhand index pointing down. The midnight game. Amelia and her boyfriend Jake were always up for trying new things. From ghost tours to creepy urban legends, they thrived on thrills and chills. So when Amelia stumbled upon an old online forum discussing the midnight game, she knew it was something they had to try. "This one's different," Amelia said, scrolling through the instructions on her laptop. Jake leaned over her shoulder, reading. "Summon a spirit by knocking on the door at midnight? Sounds like a cheap thrill." Amelia grinned. "Scared?" Jake smirked. "Please. Let's do it." That night, they prepared everything. A candle for each of them, a piece of paper, a drop of blood, and a lighter. At exactly 11:55 p.m., they sat in the dark living room of Jake's house, surrounded by an eerie silence. The air was heavy, as if the house itself was holding its breath. "Are you sure we should do this?" Jake asked. Amelia nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. "It's just a game." They followed the instructions carefully, writing their names on the pieces of paper and pricking their fingers to smear a single drop of blood onto the paper. At precisely midnight, they stood in front of the front door. "Ready?" Amelia whispered. Jake nodded, and together they knocked on the door 22 times, finishing exactly at the stroke of midnight. Then they blew out their candles. For a moment, nothing happened. Jake laughed nervously. Well, that was anticlimactic. But Amelia wasn't laughing. She relit her candle, her eyes darting around the room. "Jake, something feels wrong." "Come on, it's just a silly game," he said, lighting his own candle. But then they heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping. It came from the hallway, growing louder with each passing second. Jake froze. "What the hell is that?" Amelia clutched her candle tightly. "It's part of the game. It's supposed to mean, the spirit is here." "Spirit? You mean this isn't just for fun?" Jake hissed. "Keep your candle lit," Amelia whispered. "That's the rule. If it goes out, you have to relight it immediately. And no matter what, don't look directly at it." The tapping stopped, replaced by a soft shuffling sound. It was coming closer. "Amelia," Jake whispered. "I think someone's in the house." "No," she said. "It's not someone. It's—" Before she could finish, Jake's candle flickered and went out. "Light it," Amelia hissed. Jake fumbled with the lighter, his hands shaking. The shuffling sound was now in the room with them. Hurry? Amelia urged, her own candle trembling in her hand. The lighter sparked but the flame wouldn't catch. Then the shuffling stopped. Jake? Amelia whispered, tears streaming down her face. She could feel it. Something was standing right behind her. Jake's candle finally reignited, and the room was bathed in the faint, flickering glow of their candles. But whatever was in the room with them wasn't gone. They could hear its breathing now, slow, deep, and raspy. Amelia, Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. What do we do? She tried to remember the rules. We have to survive until 3:33 a.m. Jake glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 12:17 a.m. For the next 2 hours they stayed in the living room, clutching their candles like lifelines. The thing in the shadows didn't leave. It circled them, its presence pressing against their senses, suffocating and cold. At one point, Jake's candle flickered again, and Amelia screamed, forcing him to relight it as quickly as he could. It's watching us, Jake whispered. Don't talk to it, Amelia snapped. That's another rule. Don't acknowledge it. Finally, at 3:33 a.m., the house went silent. The oppressive weight lifted and the air felt warm again. It's over, Amelia said, collapsing onto the couch. Jake sat beside her, his face pale and drawn. Never again. I'm done with this paranormal crap. But as they laughed nervously, relieved that the nightmare was over, the clock on the wall struck 3:34 a.m. The sound of knocking echoed from the front door. Question for you. If you were Amelia and Jake, would you open the door? Or pretend you didn't hear it? Let me know in the comments. Backhand index pointing down. Story 5. The Forgotten Tunnel. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a small road trip to explore the outskirts of their city. Hannah and her boyfriend Ethan loved spontaneous adventures, and when Ethan suggested they take a detour to check out an old, abandoned railway tunnel, Hannah was skeptical but intrigued. Are you sure about this? Hannah asked as they pulled up to the overgrown entrance of the tunnel. Ethan grinned. Come on, how often do we get to explore something this creepy? Look at it, it's like something out of a horror movie. Hannah glanced at the tunnel's gaping mouth. It was dark, unnaturally dark, as if the light outside refused to penetrate its depths. The air around the entrance was colder than it should have been for a summer evening, and the faint smell of damp earth mixed with something metallic lingered in the air. I don't know, Hannah trailed off, staring into the void. Ethan grabbed a flashlight from the back seat and handed her another. It's just a tunnel. We'll be in and out in 10 minutes. What's the worst that could happen? The tunnel stretched on much farther than either of them had anticipated. The walls were damp, the ceiling was cracked in places, and the tracks had long since rusted. Their footsteps echoed eerily, creating the illusion that someone, or something, was walking just behind them. This place gives me the creeps, Hannah admitted, gripping Ethan's arm tightly. He laughed softly, though his own voice sounded hollow. Don't worry. There's nothing in here but bats and spiders. But as they continued deeper into the tunnel, the air grew colder. The flashlight beams seemed weaker, barely illuminating a few feet ahead of them. And then they heard it. A faint whisper. Hannah froze, her blood turning to ice. Did you hear that? Ethan stopped, shining his flashlight around. Hear what? The whisper came again, this time louder. It wasn't clear, it sounded like a mix of voices, overlapping and murmuring as though a crowd of people was speaking just out of earshot. I don't like this, Hannah said, her voice trembling. Let's go back. Ethan hesitated. It's probably just the wind. Wind doesn't sound like that, she snapped. As they turned to leave, the whispers grew louder, filling the tunnel. It wasn't coming from one direction, it was coming from everywhere. And then the flashlight in Ethan's hand flickered and went out. Ethan? Hannah cried, gripping his arm. Hang on, he said, smacking the flashlight. It sputtered back to life, but its beam was dimmer now, barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. Hannah's flashlight was still working, but the beam seemed weaker, as if the darkness itself was swallowing the light. That's it. We're leaving, she said firmly. They hurried back the way they came, but after a few minutes of walking, Ethan stopped. Wait, wasn't the entrance closer than this? He asked. Hannah frowned. It should be right there. But the entrance was gone. They shone their flashlights ahead, searching for the familiar outline of the tunnel's opening, but all they saw was more darkness. That's not possible, Ethan muttered, his voice shaking. We didn't go that far in. Hannah's heart pounded in her chest. We need to keep moving. Maybe we got turned around. As they walked, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They couldn't make out what was being said, but the tone was hostile, angry. And then they saw it. A figure, standing motionless in the middle of the tunnel, just beyond the reach of their flashlights. Hannah gasped, clutching Ethan's arm. "Do you see that?" Ethan nodded, his face pale. "Yeah. Let's just keep walking." They tried to move past it, but no matter how far they walked, the figure remained the same distance ahead of them. "Is it following us?" Hannah whispered. "No," Ethan said. "It's waiting for us." The whispers turned to faint cries, then loud wails. The walls of the tunnel seemed to close in around them, and the air grew so cold that their breath misted in front of them. Suddenly Hannah's flashlight flickered and died, plunging them into near-total darkness. "Ethan," she screamed, gripping his arm. "I've got you," he said, holding her close. But his voice was trembling. The wails turned to screams, piercing, inhuman shrieks that echoed all around them. And then, just as suddenly, the sound stopped. Silence. When the flashlight flickered back to life, they saw that the figure was gone. But the tunnel was no longer empty. The walls were lined with shadowy shapes, dozens of them, all staring at them with hollow, empty eyes. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there watching. "Run," Ethan whispered. They bolted, sprinting as fast as they could, their footsteps pounding against the damp ground. The shadowy figures didn't follow, but their presence seemed to press against Hannah's back, urging her to go faster. Finally, after what felt like hours, they saw the faint outline of the tunnel's entrance. They burst out into the open air, gasping for breath. When they turned around, the tunnel entrance was no longer there. All that remained was a solid wall of stone, as if the tunnel had never existed. Question for you. If you were Hannah or Ethan, would you ever tell anyone what happened, or keep it a secret forever? Let me know in the comments. Backhand index pointing down. Story 6, The Locked Room. "You don't believe me, do you?" Emma asked, crossing her arms as she stared at her boyfriend, Jake. Jake smirked, leaning against the kitchen counter. "I'm just saying it's probably nothing. Houses creak, pipes groan, it's an old place." Emma narrowed her eyes. "Jake, I heard the sound of furniture moving upstairs. It wasn't pipes or creaks. I wasn't imagining it." Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. They'd been renting the old Victorian house for a few weeks, and while Jake loved its antique charm, Emma couldn't shake the uneasy feeling she'd had since they moved in. There was something off about the place, especially about the locked room at the end of the upstairs hallway. Jake had tried to pick the lock when they first moved in, out of sheer curiosity, but it wouldn't budge. The landlord was evasive when Emma had asked about it, brushing off her concerns with a dismissive, "It's just storage. Nothing you need to worry about." But Emma did worry. Especially after she started hearing the sounds, footsteps late at night, the faint hum of a melody she couldn't quite place, and most recently, the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. "Let's check it out," Jake said suddenly, grabbing a flashlight. Emma blinked. "Check what out?" "The locked room. If it's bothering you this much, let's get to the bottom of it." "Jake, we don't have the key." "We don't need it," he said with a mischievous grin, holding up a crowbar. A few minutes later, they were standing in front of the door. The hallway was dimly lit, and the air felt colder than usual. Emma wrapped her arms around herself, glancing nervously at the locked door. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" she whispered. Jake rolled his eyes. "It's just a room, Em. Nothing to be scared of." With that, he wedged the crowbar into the doorframe and began to pry. The wood groaned in protest, but after a few moments, the lock gave way with a sharp crack. The door swung open. The room was empty. Emma frowned, stepping inside. "This is it? It's just a dusty old room." Jake shone the flashlight around, revealing bare wooden floors and peeling wallpaper. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, and cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling. But then Emma noticed something. The floorboards near the center of the room were scuffed, as if something heavy had been moved across them recently. "Look," she said, pointing. Jake knelt down, running his hand over the marks. "Huh. Weird." As he spoke, the flashlight flickered. Emma's stomach tightened. "Did you see that?" "It's just the batteries," Jake said, tapping the flashlight. But Emma wasn't so sure. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them. Emma yelped, spinning around. "What the—" Jake jumped to his feet, rushing to the door. He twisted the knob, but it wouldn't budge. "It's stuck," he said, his voice tight. "No, it's locked," Emma said, her voice shaking. Jake opened the door. "I'm trying," he snapped, yanking at the knob. The flashlight flickered again, plunging them into darkness for a moment before sputtering back to life. And then they heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound coming from beneath the floorboards. "Is someone down there?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake didn't respond. He was staring at the floor, his face pale. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't random, it was deliberate, like someone knocking in a pattern. Jake grabbed the crowbar. "Help me move this," he said, pointing to the scuffed floorboards. Emma hesitated. "Jake, maybe we shouldn't." "Do you want to stay locked in here?" he snapped. Reluctantly, Emma helped him pry up the floorboards. Beneath them was a small, dark space, a crawl space. And inside the crawl space was a box. Jake reached down and pulled the box out. It was old, made of wood, with strange symbols carved into its surface. The air around it felt colder, and Emma had the sudden urge to tell Jake to put it back. "Don't open it," she said quickly. Jake looked at her. "What? Why not?" "I just have a bad feeling," she admitted. Jake hesitated, then shrugged. "It's just a box." He pried it open. Inside were a collection of old black and white photographs, a small rusted key, and a journal with frayed pages. Jake picked up the journal and flipped it open. The writing was messy, almost frantic, and the pages were filled with strange drawings, figures with hollow eyes, shadowy shapes, and what looked like a map of the house. "What is this?" Jake muttered, flipping through the pages. Emma picked up one of the photographs. It showed a group of people standing in front of the house. Their faces were blurred, but something about the way they were standing, rigid and unnatural, sent a chill down her spine. And then she saw it. In the corner of the photo, barely visible, was a shadowy figure standing in the window of the locked room. The tapping started again, louder this time, and now it was accompanied by a low, guttural whisper. Jake dropped the journal, his hands trembling. "We need to get out of here," he said. But before they could do anything, the flashlight went out completely, plunging them into darkness. The whispers grew louder, surrounding them, and the air became so cold that Emma could see her breath. And then, just as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The door creaked open. Jake and Emma didn't hesitate. They ran out of the room, down the stairs, and out of the house, not stopping until they were in the safety of their car. As they sat there, trying to catch their breath, Emma looked back at the house. The light in the locked room was on. "Question for you. If you found a mysterious box like Jake and Emma did, would you open it, or leave it alone? Let me know in the comments." Backhand index pointing down. Story 7. The Whispering Wood. "You know this is a bad idea, right?" Lauren said, crossing her arms and glaring at Eric. Eric laughed, adjusting the straps of his backpack. "Come on, Lauren. It's just a camping trip. Don't tell me you're scared of a few trees." "It's not the trees I'm worried about," Lauren muttered, glancing toward the dense woods ahead. The Whispering Woods had a reputation. Locals said people who ventured too deep never came back, or if they did, they weren't the same. There were stories about strange voices, shadowy figures, and an oppressive feeling of being watched. But Eric, ever the skeptic, had convinced her to join him on a weekend camping trip. "It'll be fun," he'd said. "A little adventure." Now, standing at the edge of the forest as the sun dipped below the horizon, Lauren wasn't so sure. They hiked for a few hours before finding a clearing to set up camp. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting together like skeletal hands. The silence was unnerving. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, heavy stillness. As Eric set up the tent, Lauren wandered to the edge of the clearing. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction, the trees becoming darker and more tangled the farther she looked. And then she heard it. A faint whisper so soft it could have been the wind. But there was no wind. Lauren froze, her heart racing. "Eric," she called out, her voice trembling. "What?" he replied, poking his head out of the tent. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" She hesitated. "Nothing." "Never mind." But as she turned back toward the tent, she could have sworn she saw movement in the shadows. That night, as they sat by the fire, Eric tried to lighten the mood. "You know, the stories about these woods are probably just made up to scare kids," he said, poking at the fire with a stick. "Urban legends." Lauren stared into the flames, hugging her knees. "Maybe. But there's always some truth to those stories, isn't there?" Eric rolled his eyes. "What, like ghosts? Monsters? Come on, Lauren. You're smarter than that." "I'm serious," she said. "What about the people who disappeared? What about the ones who came back and wouldn't talk about what happened?" Eric shrugged. "People get lost in the woods all the time. And the ones who came back, probably just embarrassed they got scared by their own shadow." Lauren didn't respond, because she was starting to hear it again. The whispering. It was faint, like a distant conversation just out of earshot. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes darting toward the trees. Eric frowned. "What are you talking about?" The whispering, she said, her voice barely audible. It's coming from the woods. Eric listened for a moment, then shook his head. You're imagining things. But Lauren wasn't so sure. They crawled into the tent a little after midnight. Lauren lay awake, staring at the nylon ceiling, her ears straining for any sound. Eric was already snoring softly beside her. That's when she heard it again. The whispering was louder now, closer. It didn't sound like one voice, it sounded like many, overlapping and echoing. Lauren sat up, her heart pounding. Eric, she whispered, shaking his shoulder. He mumbled, half asleep. Listen, she said, her voice trembling. Do you hear it now? Eric groaned, sitting up. Lauren, it's probably just the wind. A loud snap cut him off. They both froze, staring at each other. That wasn't the wind, Eric said, his voice low. The whispering grew louder, surrounding them. It wasn't pleading anymore, it was angry. Who's out there? Eric shouted, unzipping the tent and stepping outside. Eric, wait. Lauren hissed, but he was already gone. Outside, the fire had burned down to embers, casting long, flickering shadows across the clearing. Eric stood in the center, turning in circles, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. Hello, he called out. Who's there? The whispering stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. See? Eric said, turning back toward the tent. It's nothing. Just. A shadow darted behind him. Eric, behind you? Lauren screamed. He spun around, but there was nothing there. The whispering started again, louder this time, and now it was coming from all directions. We need to leave, Lauren said, grabbing his arm. Eric nodded, his bravado gone. They packed up as quickly as they could, their movements frantic. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, as if the forest itself was alive and angry. As they started down the trail, the flashlight flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows on the trees. Keep moving, Eric said, his voice tight. But the trail didn't look right. The trees seemed closer together, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. The path was overgrown, and Lauren was sure they hadn't come this way before. We're lost, she whispered, panic rising in her chest. No, we're not, Eric said, though he didn't sound convinced. And then they saw it. The clearing. Their campsite. That's not possible, Eric said, his voice shaking. We've been walking for at least an hour. Lauren grabbed his arm. Eric, we need to keep moving. We can't stay here. But before they could take another step, the whispering stopped. And something stepped out of the woods. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that were too long and a face that wasn't quite human. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. Lauren couldn't move. Eric grabbed her hand and yanked her backward. Run, he shouted. They ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches clawing at their faces and arms. The whispering was deafening now, and Lauren could feel something behind them, closing in. They burst out of the woods just as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. Lauren collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. Eric stood beside her, staring back at the forest. The whispering had stopped, and the woods were silent again. We're not coming back here, Eric said, his voice shaking. Lauren nodded, her eyes wide with fear. But as they turned to leave, Lauren noticed something on the ground beside her. A single footprint. It wasn't hers. And it wasn't Eric's. It was too large, too twisted. And it was facing the woods. Question for you. Would you ever camp in a place with a creepy reputation like the Whispering Woods? Let me know in the comments. Backhand index pointing down.